Hello, my name is Elena. I like to read. Could use a bit of a pick-me-up, so thought I would talk about some of the books that I've read this year. Starting with David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. You've read it, you've heard about it. If I could just add my 2 cents, it truly is a masterclass in character development. It is a Bildungsroman roman where you follow along the life of a young boy who is soon orphaned and placed into boarding school by an evil stepfather and his aunt. He then runs away and meets all sorts of colorful characters, from the macabre to the hilarious, and it's about how these interactions really inform his decisions and the various transitions that he goes through in his life. But this is the perfect book to start the year off with. I then did a 180 into a genre I like to call female rage, and finally devoured this little one, The Vegetarian by Han Kang. Of course, congratulations to this author for winning the Nobel Peace Prize in Literature last year. I read Greek Lessons a few years ago, and while this one was on my TBR, of course. But it truly makes beauty out of the grotesque. A woman has finally found her purpose and intention in life, and she's simultaneously going through a mental breakdown. There's violence, there's sex, there's art, there's the perversity in just the livelihood of being a human. And of course, it's a reflection also on the few people that are in her life and how they react to her becoming this other person. And of course, there's a question about womanhood and independence. It's bizarre and strange, but if you're going to read about a woman's struggle, this is one to read. I'm so glad I finally read it. The next 2 books can be friends. Henry James and Edith Wharton were actually friends, but I'll start off with The Bostonians by Henry James. It's classic post-Civil War, old world, antebellum South meets New Age feminism in New England. And a young lady has a gift of oration, and so she's sort of heralded by this feminist to be the symbol of their movement, and the extreme movement of eschewing men altogether for women's rights and freedom. And she also meets a Southern gentleman who is searching for redemption in New England, and he is your typical old Southern gentleman who thinks that feminism is a folly and an exercise in, I don't know, tedious boredom, or something that is something to be laughed at, right, and ridiculed. And it's this sort of question of choice, and of course the backdrop of society, and what will this woman decide? But yeah, this one also left me enraged a bit, as well as the next book by Edith Wharton, Custom of the Country. Look at this gorgeous just cover in the back. This is probably my least favorite Wharton. There we have this innocent, in The Bostonians, our protagonist is an innocent young lady who wants to do right by everyone, and wants to be heard, but yet doesn't want to ruffle too many feathers. But she has conviction. They might be naive, they might be innocent, Well, this protagonist is definitely an anti-hero. She basically convinces her mother and father to move her and them to New York City so that she can infiltrate old New York society, marry well off, and live a decadent and opulent life. And she's willing to go to any means necessary. And we're talking about any means. You know, ruination, what? And so it begs the question of, is this person just an evil person, or is she really, you know, just another cog in this society's machine, and the demand of what New York society at the time expected of women, and all that entails. But yes, this this book pissed me off a little bit, for sure. And is heartbreaking. But then we took a little bit of a breather. I'm glad that we did with Dodie Smith's I Capture the Castle. Dodie Smith is the same author who wrote 101 Dalmatians. So this book is about Cassandra Mortmain and her family, and she's 17 years old, and she's at the start of this novel is starting a new journal, capturing the quotidian effects of her life, and they live in this decrepit castle in England and are penny pinching, and it's very much a lesson in how to do so at the time. And then their lives are changed or challenged, or at least their daily routines are challenged by the appearance of a few Americans, and how that appearance and interaction with them changes and challenges her relationship with herself and her sister. But definitely just great writing, incredibly readable. It was exactly what I needed at the time. And then we do another change, just really tackling the TBR, okay? Gabriel Garcia Marquez's very divisive novel, Love in the Time of Cholera. This is a novel I would have loved to talk about this book in a book club or like an academic setting, truly. It's a novel about obsession, I think, first and foremost. There's a love story here, right? That two people meet as young people, and then one of them changes her heart and decides to marry a well-to-do doctor, and the other lover decides to hold on to their promise and follow her. And so he witnesses all of her trials and tribulations and living, and from her marriage to the birth of her children, to estrangement with her husband, to widowhood. But I definitely understand why this book would bother some. And yes, I was also shaken a little bit by the fact that rape is so rampant and nonchalantly mentioned in this book. For example, one of the protagonists is, I think he's raped, and that's how he loses his virginity. So there is that trigger warning, but this is a great work of fiction. Garcia Marquez knows how to tell a story, and I was incredibly invested all the way through, apart from unsavory bits. And then another book that I would highly recommend is Dorothy Baker's Cassandra at the Wedding. So Cassandra Edwards is a graduate student at Berkeley, and she is gay and brilliant, and she's on a mission. She's driving home to her family's ranch to save her sister from an unsavory marriage. Her sister is about to marry an affluent New England doctor, and Cassandra is her twin. And so what does that entail, right? What does it mean to save someone? I think this book also captures beautifully like the power of memory and individual memory, what we choose to remember and how we remember, because after, meeting her sister Judith at the ranch, they of course discuss some of their childhood and the mental distress that their mother went through and that now Cassandra is also going through. Those challenges, but also how they are different, right? Cassandra is expecting that Judith doesn't want this wedding. And she doesn't want to ask herself, like, what if I am my own person and Judith is her own person, right? She doesn't want to face that, the realities of being an individual. But I want to grab a drink with Cassandra because she's a little bit batshit. She's a little bit conniving, she's self-aware, a little bit of pitiful, but brilliant. So thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you, Dorothy Baker. Another book I thoroughly enjoyed by an author I've never read, Sasha Naspini Neves. A husband dies and the widow domesticates a chicken. She domesticates a chicken, and then that chicken one night goes through paralysis, and so she calls the vet, and a whole other world unravels, and they talk about the past and what it means. Again, always the identity of womanhood and the hard decisions and tenuous constraints and demands of a simple life. But this one you can read in an afternoon sitting, and it packs a punch. Finally, years later, we read Ewan McEwen's Lessons. I thoroughly enjoy this author. I've read several of his books, including Atonement, which is one of the best novels of like a psychological fiction, honestly. This one was so ambitious that I could see this coming from an amateur writer. But Ewan McEwen is not that. But the timing, the trajectory of this goes from post-World War II up to the 2020 pandemic. And so it's not a trilogy, it's just a book, and it pulls on a lot of strains, and there's a lot of things I find interesting about this book. So we are faced with the fact that, and we learn that whilst this protagonist was in boarding school, he did have an affair with his piano teacher, and that has stayed with him and has caused psychological trauma that he, I think, isn't fully aware of yet. And so it's kind of him coming to terms with that whilst also dealing with the aftermath of having a child with a German creative, and then she leaves them. And so he's a single father, and then she goes on to become this really successful author while he's a single father, and he doesn't have much to show for his life. Or does he? I suppose it's up to the interpretation, right? But again, this book mentions some really interesting historical figures and history, but then it doesn't seem to really complete those trains of plot or development. So he is coming out with a new book this fall, I think. It's sci-fi, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I just didn't quite, it was interesting and I'm glad I read it, but it's not something that I think I'll be thinking about in the future at all. It's kind of a one and done. Oh, hello. Had to put some Austen in there. So Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Again, you've read it, you've heard of it. A family of females are forced to vacate their vast estate and their help by moving to a cottage to accommodate their new lifestyle and living. And these sisters are faced with some challenges and are vastly different, right? We have Eleanor and Marianne, and they both meet men and have different experiences, but I think it's the question of how to love and the various ways that love portrays itself in one's life or is questioned, you know, whether it's love, whether it's infatuation, whether it's lust, whether it's all kinds of like the spectrum of love and living, and also being young and what time can do to that love and teach us over time. Not my favorite Austen. Still, you know, I still love me and Eliot in Persuasion and of course Pride and Prejudice, but so glad that I actually also, so all of my Austen editions are this annotated edition by David Chapard, and it's because the opposite pages, you know, they offer accurate like depictions of the time and what, you know, like a term would mean at the time, what a barouche would look like. But yes, this, if you've read Austen, you know her wit. There's definitely that in this, and no one does wit like Jane Austen. And finally, wrapping up the reading, Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell, an author that I love as well. I've read North and South and Wives and Daughters, both just incredible novels. This is a aggregation of vignettes, essentially about a town that is run by middle-aged women. And the first story is a Captain Brown and his daughters are moving into Cranford, and these ladies in their bonnets are asking, how will they cope? How will they cope with a new man in town? There's a funny story in here also about a kitty and some lace. But all of these women are incredibly unique and colorful, and I'm just so invested in all of these little stories. But this is actually like, if this is perfect to read for tea time or to get lost a little bit in a cafe, but Gaskell has done it again. But that wraps up the reading so far for this year, and February is off to a slow start in reading. There's just a lot of priorities, and I don't know if I'm the only one feeling incredibly overwhelmed by life. And so I hope that you're all keeping well and reading something that is maybe giving you some peace. And hopefully we'll keep reading in this year, and thank you for watching. Bye.